30 days after Continental Freight Systems fired him, the truck stopped moving. Across 11 states, GPS pins froze mid-route. Warehouse doors sat open with nothing coming through. In the Denver Operations Center, the massive screens bled red, and nobody in the room, not the fancy consultants Gary Nolan had flown in from Chicago, nor the high-paid engineers, could tell the CEO, Emily Sanders, why the system had collapsed. Buried deep in an error log, a single, unrecognized name surfaced: David Turner. Emily stared at the screen, her heart racing. "Who is that?" she asked. Nobody knew. 30 days earlier, David Turner had been sitting in the basement of the Continental Freight Systems building, 2 floors below the glass offices and the good coffee. He was fixing a printer that nobody upstairs even knew existed. He wore the same navy polo shirt the company issued to support staff. No name badge, just a barcode. He had worked there for 8 years, yet he was a ghost. At 9:00 a.m. that morning, a mandatory all-staff meeting was called. David went, because everyone went. He sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching Gary Nolan take the stage. Gary was the VP of Operations, a man whose suit cost more than David's monthly rent. "Continental is entering a new era," Gary announced, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "We've partnered with Ridgeline Consulting to modernize our infrastructure. That means new tools, new processes, and unfortunately, some restructuring." The list appeared on the screen behind him, 41 names. David's was 17th. He didn't react. He had learned a long time ago that in a room like that, the moment you flinch, people remember it. He sat still, read his own name, and looked down at his hands. Beside him, a younger technician whispered, "That's brutal, man." David just nodded. There was nothing to say. An hour later, a junior HR coordinator handed him a folder at his desk. "Security will walk you out at noon," she said without looking him in the eye. Sandra Fields, who had worked at Continental for 11 years, watched it happen from the hallway. She had known David before he became the guy in the basement. She almost stepped in to say something, but Gary Nolan was standing 20 feet away, and Sandra had a mortgage to pay. She stayed silent. At noon, David walked out into the Denver cold, carrying a small box with a coffee mug and a photo of his daughter Maddie. The security guard Curtis, a man who had worked the desk longer than David had worked upstairs, looked at him and said, "Take care of yourself, Turner." It was the only kindness he received that day. David drove to pick up Maddie from school. She was 9, her hair in a messy ponytail, her backpack heavier than she was. When she climbed into the truck, she looked at him. "You're early." "Wanted to see you?" David smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, kid, just wanted to see you." That night, they made spaghetti together. He didn't mention the company once. After she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the termination folder. He didn't open it. He just sat in the quiet, knowing that the company he had single-handedly kept running for 8 years had just erased him in a single morning. Sandra Fields spent the next week processing severance files for the 41 people on that list. Most of it was routine years of service, unused vacation days, COBRA paperwork. But David Turner's file was different, and it took her 2 days to understand why. Continental calculated severance based on continuous tenure, which meant pulling personnel records all the way back to a person's original hire date. David's hire date wasn't 8 years ago, it was 12. The system had him down as a support technician with 8 years in that specific role. But buried underneath, in an old scanned folder from the company's acquisition period, was a different document entirely. An intellectual property assignment agreement. Sandra read it, then read it again. 8 years ago, a private equity firm called Brightwell Capital had bought a scrappy startup called Rootworks and folded it into Continental Freight Systems. The agreement assigned all rights to a piece of software called Atlas Core to Continental in exchange for a settlement figure and continued employment. The author listed on the patent filing was David J. Turner. Sandra's hands trembled. Atlas Core wasn't just some old side project. It was the system that ran the entire company. Every route, every dock assignment, every load calculation was handled by code written 12 years ago by a 26-year-old engineer working out of a garage in Lakewood. And for 8 years, that man had been fixing printers in the basement while Gary Nolan called their infrastructure outdated. Sandra checked the signature line against the David Turner she had just processed. The employee ID matched, and the social security number matched. She sat there in the silence of the HR wing, her coffee going cold, realizing that Gary Nolan had just fired the only person who actually understood how the company worked. Technically, the confidentiality clause bound her to silence, and Gary had made it clear that job security at Continental depended on staying in your lane. You process the paperwork, Sandra. You don't have to understand it, Gary had told her 3 months ago. She had smiled and nodded, and she hated herself for it. But this time, she couldn't just let it go. She made a copy of the file, slid it into a folder at the back of her desk drawer underneath a stack of expired parking permits, and told herself she would figure out what to do with it later. Later felt safer than now. 3 days later, the real trouble began. Ridgeline Consulting arrived with their sleek laptops and a deck titled Continental Forward. Their lead engineer, a man named Patrick Kessler, began walking the operations floor. He talked about cleaning up the legacy code and modernizing the architecture. What Patrick didn't know, because nobody had told him, was that Atlas Core wasn't built like modern systems. It had grown organically over 12 years, patched and extended by one person who understood every single dependency, because he had written every single one of them. There was no design document. There were no manuals explaining why the failover logic checked inventory in a specific order, or why certain warehouse codes triggered manual overrides. Ridgeline started optimizing. They rewrote routing tables, deleted what they called redundant conditional statements, and congratulated themselves on reducing technical debt. They never stopped to ask why those lines of code existed in the first place, because the only person who could have explained it was gone. Within a week, the cracks appeared. A shipment was routed to the wrong regional hub. A load manifest was duplicated across 2 trucks. A driver named Ali Banks sat outside a locked warehouse in Amarillo for 40 minutes because the system had scheduled his delivery to a dock that had been decommissioned 2 years ago. Emily Sanders got her first flagged report on a Tuesday. It was minor, but it nagged at her. She forwarded it to Gary, but he just dismissed it. You don't modernize a 12-year-old system without some turbulence, he said. Ridgeline is already cleaning it up. At home that evening, David sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through a press release about the new partnership. He read the quotes from Gary about unlocking efficiency and felt a tightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. What face is that? Maddie asked from across the table, looking up from her math worksheet. What face? David asked. The one where you're thinking about work but pretending you're not. David almost laughed. I'm not supposed to think about work anymore, kid. I don't have one. Is that sad? She asked, tilting her head. David considered lying, the way he had been considering lying to everyone for 8 years. A little, he finally said. But we're okay. You know that, right? I know, Maddie said, and went right back to her math, trusting him with the simple, absolute faith of a 9-year-old. The errors kept coming, small and scattered, but Emily was starting to keep a list. By the following week, she had 6 entries. She brought it to a board call, and for the first time, the pressure she had been managing felt real. Federal contracts have on-time delivery clauses. Emily, board member Harriet Doyle reminded her. If Continental starts missing them because of a transition you approved, That's not a Ridgeline problem. That's a you problem. Emily promised she would handle it, but as she walked out of the meeting, she felt a cold shiver of doubt. She went back to her office, and that night, while working late, she pulled up an archived video from an old technical review meeting. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, stood a man in a support uniform, watching the room with an intensity that the others didn't seem to notice. He paused the video, frowned, and couldn't place why his face felt so familiar. The next morning, a folded piece of paper sat on her desk. It was unsigned, and the handwriting was unrecognizable. It contained 7 words. Ask who wrote Atlas Core originally. Chapter 3. The crash and the confrontation the next 9 days were a slow-motion car crash. On a Tuesday morning, at 6:40 a.m., Atlas Core went down completely. It wasn't a single point of failure, it was a cascade. The routing table Ridgeline had cleaned up the week before triggered a failover sequence that no longer matched the manual override logic buried 3 layers beneath the surface. Once that mismatch hit, the entire national dispatch system locked into a loop it couldn't resolve. Trucks already en route kept moving based on catch data until they didn't. New shipments had nowhere to go. By 7:30 a.m., the Denver operations floor looked like a building during a fire drill. Emily arrived at 8 a.m. The floor was chaos, phones ringing on every desk, dispatch coordinators standing, and the wall-mounted map of the country glowing almost entirely in red. Patrick Kessler and his team were hovering over terminals, talking over each other, unable to explain why the system had locked. "How many trucks are stopped?" Emily asked, her voice tight. A dispatch lead looked up, pale. "Best guess, ma'am?" "Around 4,000. Emily didn't waste time with Gary's excuses. She went to her office, opened the desk drawer, and pulled out the folded note. Ask who wrote Atlas Core originally. She didn't call anyone. She looked up an old expense report from years ago, found an address in Lakewood, and drove. She found the house a modest place with maples, just starting to turn color. When David opened the door, he was wearing a flannel shirt, his sleeves pushed up, a dish towel in his hand. He looked at her, the CEO of the company that had discarded him like trash 3 weeks earlier, and his expression didn't change. "Miss Sanders," he said. "Emily," she corrected. "Can I come in?" Behind him, Maddie appeared, curious. David glanced at his daughter, then back at Emily. "I don't think that's a good idea." "The whole system is down, David," Emily said, her voice desperate. 4,000 trucks are frozen on the road. I don't know what's happening, and nobody in that building can tell me." "I heard," David said, "but I don't work there anymore." "I know. I'm asking anyway. You fired me a month ago without a word, and now you're on my porch asking me to fix the thing you fired me for building?" His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. That was somehow worse. "I didn't know what I was firing," Emily said. "I know that's not a good enough answer, but it's the true one." David looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. She thought he might say yes, but he just shook his head. "I'm sorry. I've got my daughter." He closed the door gently, not slamming it, just closing it with a finality that hit Emily harder than a scream. She stood on the porch, the maples rustling above her, the weight of a broken national network pressing down on her chest. She drove back to the office with more questions than she'd arrived with. Back at the office, she found Sandra in the HR wing. "I need you to tell me everything about David Turner," Emily demanded. "All of it." Sandra hesitated, then slid the folder across the desk. Emily read the IP assignment, the patent filing, and the confidentiality clause. 12 years of a system built by one man, who the company had quietly agreed to erase from its own history in exchange for a settlement and a dead-end support job. "Does Gary know?" Emily asked. "I don't think he knew who David was. Sandra said. I think he was just a name on a spreadsheet. Then, Sandra hesitated. There's something else. Ridgeline Consulting. The parent entity on their contract is called Coldwater Strategic Partners. I ran a background check on their principal last month. His last name is Nolan. Trent Nolan. Gary's brother-in-law. Emily felt the pieces click into place. A no-bid contract, a failing system, and a brother-in-law waiting to profit. It wasn't just incompetence. It was greed. Emily drove back to Lakewood. It was past 8 p.m. when she knocked again. David opened the door, as if he had been waiting. I'm not here as your CEO, Emily said before he could speak. I'm here because I fired you for something I didn't do. I let a man use your absence to profit off a contract that has taken down an entire system. I should have known who was in my own building. David studied her face in the porch light. Behind him, Maddie's voice called out. He answered without turning. Nobody, baby. Go finish your show. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. You want me to fix it? Yes. Don't thank me yet, David said, his voice cold. You haven't seen what they did to my code. If you like this video, then please like the video and subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon. Thank